Welcome to the New Jersey Turfgrass webinar series. My name is Mike Reed, and we're glad that you're here. I'm really glad that you're here. I'm going to be your host for tonight's session and a couple other sessions a little bit farther down the line. I'd like to start off by saying thank you to our sponsors. It's through their generosity and their support that has made this a free webinar possible. Without them, we couldn't be doing it because we actually had to purchase software that wasn't cheap and then go through a whole training process. So folks like Save-A-Tree, Harrell's, Fisher, Plant Food, Mountain View Seed, Tech Terrace, Syngenta. If I mentioned Grassroots once, I'll say it again, Cinetech, Fisher & Son. These folks came out and supported us, and we're deeply appreciative of that. Guys, one of the things that we need to understand is because you are, hold on, this is not moving, now it's moving. We're not going to be answering questions during the presentation. There is a chat box that you can see on the bottom of your control panel. So make sure that you're going to submit all your questions through the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, type them into the chat box, and hopefully I will be able to figure it out and give you an answer. And I just got a little note here from Jim that I still have him muted. So Dr. Murphy, fear not, I will unmute you. You are now unmuted.
Now I'm live, huh?
Yeah, technical glitch avoided.
Yes.
During the presentation, guys, there are going to be quizzes issued. In order to receive credits, you must be present not only for the entire presentation, but you also must participate in the quizzes. Now, this is not a pass or fail thing. This is just to show that you were paying attention during the presentation. If you don't take all the quizzes, well, then you're not going to get your credits for tonight's class. The next most important thing that we need to discuss is the fact that we have to have you email a copy of you holding your license to executive or exec director at turfgrass.org. You're going to have to submit that to us, a picture of you holding your license to exec director at New Jersey or njturfgrass.org. And that way we can validate the person who's on the webinar is actually the person. Make sure that in the subject line, you put 12/9/2020 class in the subject line. That way we can identify which class you attended. So with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce to you James Murphy, Dr. James Murphy. He leads the outreach program and produces extension material to meet the needs of a diverse clientele. He does research-based education, and his research-based programs complement his extension activities. There it is. That's the red shirt I thought you were going to wear tonight, Jim. Without any further ado.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Normally this time of the year, I am down in Atlantic City at the New Jersey Expo, and I'm usually at this hour either at a social or having dinner and having a good time. Unfortunately, COVID has got us doing this kind of stuff. So I do appreciate you coming in and attending the webinar here. And as Mike has mentioned, we're going to be talking about how to fertilize turf and protect water and get you some continuing education credits. So let me start my PowerPoint and get it into presentation mode here. All right. So there's the title slide, and to start off, eutrophication is the big buzzword scientists use to talk about water quality issues related to nutrients. And that word simply means that the biological production in the water bodies has picked up and increased to the point where it's causing problems. The recreational value of that water goes downhill. The fish populations and other organisms in the water might actually change. And if it gets bad enough, the oxygen level in the water will drop and you'll get things like fish kills happening. So These things are caused by excess nutrient load in the water, and the primary nutrients of concern here are either nitrogen or phosphorus. As all of you probably know very well, New Jersey created a fertilizer law, and it went into effect in 2011, and it requires us to do certification training and education in these 5 areas: environmental risks to water quality, best management practices, fertilizer label information, calibration and use of equipment, and then obviously updating people on laws, rules, regulations, etc. Today, we're going to largely focus mostly on the best management practices. I'll touch a little bit on aspects of the law as they relate to BMPs, but this evening, in the roughly 50 some minutes we have left here, we'll focus on best management practices. We actually have a nice bulletin. It's Bulletin E327 that's available on our website. If you just use Bing or Google and you search for nutrient management, New Jersey, Rutgers, or if you type in Bulletin E327, you'll get this popping up as one of the first hits on that search. So it's readily accessible through the internet. And this bulletin that we put together summarizes a lot of the bullet points of all the different things you can think about related to how you manage nutrients and do it in a way that's environmentally responsible, yet do what you want to do regarding stimulating plant growth. So a lot of the comments that I'm going to talk about this evening are summarized in this bulletin, and if you care to download it and read it at your leisure, here it is. Just search for it online and it'll come up. It's free. There's no charge for it. So let's talk bullet point mode here on the screen. So I'm just going to hit the highlights, and not all of these things are going to necessarily ring true for your business where you're at work, but it's a laundry list of all the possibilities. And so hopefully many of them will ring true with you at your place of business. But I'll go through them one at a time here. The first one, as you can see on the screen, is seedings. And brand new seedings are actually probably one of the biggest threats to water quality, because there's nothing to hold anything in place. You have only seed and fertilizer sitting on top of the soil, and unless you've tilled some of it in. But regardless, there's nothing to stabilize the soil and hold it in place. And so whenever you're doing brand new seedings, keep in mind that actually represents one of the riskiest times to be putting fertilizer on the ground, and be mindful of your practices. So try to use your fertilizers wisely, be alert of big storms in the weather forecast, and perhaps delay your applications if it looks like it's going to be a washout type of event.
Hey,
Another
Jim,
thing
a quick question, Jim.
Sure thing, Mike.
It's not only the fertilizer, I think, that's a concern. Most of the soils in New Jersey, in my area, I'm North Jersey, most of them contain a high level of phosphorus. Does that also contribute to eutrophication?
Absolutely. The phosphorus that's in the soil is in a slow, much of it is in a what I would maybe oversimplify, but say it's in a slow release form. And if you have soil movement, that's very, very risky because of that. It's not just the fertilizer going, it's the soil that holds a lot of fertilizer that's going along with it. So soil erosion is the worst problem. Runoff is an issue itself, but if you can do anything to stabilize ground, keep it from washing into the water bodies, that's a big help, because the research clearly shows whenever you have soil erosion, you have massive phosphorus loading into water body in most cases. So very good point, Mike, that soil erosion is a big part of that.
Now earlier you said the word eutrophication and gave an example. Is that basically when they're talking about like dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico? Is that what that
Yep.
problem?
Yeah, that Eutrophication, that's the term scientists use to talk about that problem. The water's eutrophying, basically, the water body. Yep. Yep. That's the scientific term for it.
Thank you.
So the other thing at seeding, any kind of repair work, you want to give thought to what kind of grasses you're using. The two groups of grasses, one is a species, tall fescue is a species by itself, but then we have this group of grasses we call the fine fescues. That's actually a group of at least 3, possibly 4 or 5 different species that have very fine leaves. It's hard to actually identify on your own whether you've got a hard fescue or a chewing fescue, but those fine fescues as well as the tall fescues are very low nitrogen requiring grasses once you get them established. The trick is to get them established, and then you can treat them with a lot lower input of fertilizer than you can a lot of our other grasses. So think about whether these grasses have a niche where you're at. If they don't, obviously you don't want to use them, but if they do, this would be a way of minimizing how much you have to fertilize. Another concept to understand about managing turf, the older it gets, the less fertilizer it needs, and it's because it stores a lot of fertilizer. As it builds up and matures, it can store a lot of organic nitrogen in the organic matter that builds up at the surface and in the soil from the growth of the grass. And grasses are very good, as are a lot of other plants, at recycling nutrients that they pick up. And that doesn't happen quickly. It takes years for that to occur. But if you have any experience fertilizing a 2-year-old turf compared to a 40 or 50-year-old stand of grass, you'll easily recognize, hopefully, that you don't have to fertilize it the same way. And the older turfs require a lot less fertilizer, basically. Soil testing is important, especially when it comes to phosphate. The state now has a law that says you can't apply phosphate unless you have soil test or some other conditions that allow you to use it. So you have to be careful when you're using phosphate fertilizer that you either have a soil test to use it, or you're also allowed to use it at seeding. Another concept to think about in your programs is making more applications, but at much lower rates. And the industry that does this a lot is the golf industry. On putting greens, you'll see golf course superintendents applying nitrogen and sometimes phosphorus every 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, but they're doing it at extremely low rates. And there's a number of reasons why they do that agronomically, but there's also the environmental benefit that if you don't put very much down, it's hard to lose a lot. Even if you lost all of it, which you never will, you're not losing very much nutrients if you're putting out very small micro doses. And so that's one concept. Now, it doesn't fit everybody's business model. Not everybody's going to be able to afford to do that, but that is a very viable and effective technique if it fits your business. On the opposite end of the spectrum is applying far fewer applications, but at much higher rates. So once you get up around a half a pound, 7/10 of a pound, that's when I'm talking about higher rates. You're doing that less often, but you're going to put out more in one single application than you do the other technique I just talked about. And once you get up to a high enough level of fertilizer, you need to start incorporating slow release into it. Legally in New Jersey, that threshold is met when you're applying more than 7/10 of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet in a single application. When you're in really, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually not even a question. It's more of a statement. When I started off in the industry, we all soil tested, and that was a standard. But I've seen a huge decrease in soil testing. And if I'm not mistaken, doesn't Rutgers offer soil testing right now?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. The Rutgers has a soil test lab, and there's a number of commercial laboratories scattered across the country for that matter. I mean, it's not just New Jersey. So there are large commercial labs, and Rutgers has a lab itself that does soil testing.
And so they'll do soil testing and also give recommendations based upon the results.
Yeah, so Rutgers is one of the labs that will actually give you a recommendation on how much you should be applying. A lot of labs will just do a test and give you the results, and then you have to figure out what to do with the results. But Rutgers actually tries to figure out what you're attempting to do, and so a lot of their ability to give you recommendations is going to depend on how well you explain what you're testing for. Turf being obvious clue, but also, you know, is it irrigated? Is it high maintenance? Is it low maintenance? And that kind of thing. But soil testing is very beneficial. I do it all the time. Yeah, you know, it's good to monitor your pH levels as well as the other nutrients in the soil to make sure they're on target. And you know, save yourself a lot of money. Actually, if all you need to do is nitrogen fertilizer, fertilize, it's a lot cheaper to buy a nitrogen fertilizer than you know, complete products in some applications.
I will say this, that I do, a lot of my customers are doing soil testing. And when they're doing their soil test, we're coming back up in my neck of the woods, North Jersey, with a depletion in potassium. Because over the years, fertilizer prices went off the charts. So the way to cheapen it out was to take out components. So people
Yep.
started taking out potassium for years. And now that deficiency is starting to show up in soil tests. So
Yep. No,
that's enough. The importance
no,
of soil testing.
yeah, potassium is an important nutrient. It won't leach away, you know, in a couple of weeks, but over years of not applying it, it can leach away. It's not an environmentally hazardous material. If it gets in a water body, it's not a great threat to the water. But obviously the plants need it, and if the soils are depleting in it, then you're going to have a situation where you have a plant that's not as thrifty as it would be if you were applying it. So soil testing is a way to figure that out. In my business here, you know, my research program, I spend thousands and thousands of dollars on soil testing because I'm tracking that in my treatments. I often study how different management practices affect the nutrients in the soil, and it does change over time. It does. It's not a static thing that stays the same way day in, day out, year in, year out.
Thank you.
Yep, sure. Another thing to think about is what is your soil? Mike has asked some excellent questions about soil, and soil is important. And the high risk thing for losing nutrients is always going to be sands. And if you have sands that are over a shallow groundwater, and then that's a high risk situation. In those cases, you may not only want to cut down on how much you're applying each time you apply it, but you may actually want to also include more slow release in your program. You may want to do both, reduce your rates, apply more often, and maybe include more slow release in your products, because sandy soils over shallow groundwater are always going to be the biggest risk. Another thing to think about, and this is why we have blackout dates, when you have frozen ground or very wet soil, and in New Jersey, more often than not, it's really wet soil. We do get frozen ground, but not as much as you do farther north, obviously. But either way, applying nitrogen or phosphorus when the soil is really wet or close to frozen or frozen is a no-no. You should not do it. It's very easy for things to move when it's really wet out, so you have to avoid making any applications on really wet ground. Another thing to think about is from the standpoint of phosphorus. I'm not talking about nitrogen here, but just strictly phosphorus. A lot of people get confused on this, and I'm not against organic fertilizers, so don't take this as a knock against organic fertilizers, but a lot of time the word organic fertilizer is thrown around as though it's a very safe product, and the implication is you can't go wrong with it, and the reality is you can go wrong with it. A lot of organic fertilizers contain phosphorus, And you have to be careful with that phosphorus because it's not safe in the sense that if it gets into the water, it's going to cause a phosphorus problem in the water body. So be mindful that if you're using an organic fertilizer that contains phosphorus, that's a risk, just like the phosphorus in an inorganic fertilizer is. So just because it says organic, don't assume that it's, bulletproof safe. There are risks there. It is a nutrient, and it doesn't matter whether it's coming from an organic fertilizer or an inorganic fertilizer. It's still a threat. So use it wisely, use it appropriately. Don't apply fertilizer to dormant turf. If the grass is not growing, guess what? The grass can't take it up. It's got to be green. It's got to be healthy. It's got to be actively growing to take up any fertilizer you apply. So this makes sense in the winter when it's dormant, but this also applies to when the turf might be dormant in the summertime under drought stress. Again, if the grass is not green and actively growing and you apply nutrients, until that grass gets going, those nutrients are just laying there and they could move in a big rainstorm. So it's not a good idea to be applying to dormant turf. Don't over irrigate turf. Not everybody has control of their clients' properties in terms of irrigation, but if you work for someone that is controlling the irrigation and they're overdoing it, you need to try to encourage them to back off, because every time you make an application on wet ground, you have the risk of those nutrients moving. So try not to over irrigate and get your clients to stop doing it if they're doing it and you don't actually control that. If you ever get in a situation to improve the soil, make a healthier soil, add organic matter, reduce compaction, those kinds of things. Those are all very, very beneficial. And in the long run, they're going to help you not have to apply as much fertilizer. In many respects, fertilizer is like a Band-Aid for bad soil. And it covers up a lot of sins in the soil by applying the nutrients that the plants can't get out of the soil when it's not healthy soil that they're growing in. So again, try to make the soil as good as you possibly can. These are not easy things to do. Decompacting soil, adding organic matter, that's a lot of bulk. That's a lot of physical labor, but it is good for the soil if you can do it. Mow grass to be healthy, and if you're doing any kind of mowing, don't discharge those clippings into the streets or near catch basins and things like that. The clippings contain a significant amount of nitrogen as well as phosphorus, and it's essentially just like putting fertilizer down the storm drain if you're throwing it out into the streets.
Hey, Jim, is there a magic number on mowing height that the grass is working the most efficiently? And we'll have to call it cool season mix. Does it work most efficiently photosynthesizing its food at 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches? Is there any magic number?
Well, the magic number is as high as possible, whatever's appropriate for the site. Because if you mentioned the word photosynthesis, and what controls how much a plant can make its food is how much leaf area it has. So the more leaves it has, the more it can make food for itself through photosynthesis. And so the higher the better. Now, not all grasses are going to, fulfill their function really well at 4-inch height of cut. So 4 inches may not be acceptable, but if you can do it at 3 or 2, anything that's higher than as high as you can go is the basic rule of thumb. And so whether that's 3 or 4 inches or 5 or 6, it all depends on the function of the site and the aesthetics of the site. But mowing short is going the wrong direction. So mowing at 1 inch, 1.5 inches for cool season mixes is usually pretty darn stressful. And we always encourage people to try to get to at least 2, if not 2.5 or 3.
Thank you.
Yep, sure thing. If you happen to be managing grass right along water bodies, you certainly want to try to make sure that you treat those edges of the water well. And one of the best things you can do, if it's, the site allows it, is to establish buffer vegetation along the water body. Don't grow grass right up to the edge of the water, so that you're not trying to fertilize right up to the edge of the water. So again, riparian buffers are the buzzword here. If it's at all appropriate, try to incorporate that into your plan. Try to avoid fertilization near wellheads or any other stormwater management feature like a catch basin. I've watched plenty of applications go right over the top of a storm drain. If you do that kind of thing, at least put a cover over the storm drain before you make an application near it. It's a big no-no. Try to avoid that at all costs. Don't apply fertilizers to sidewalks, streets, parking lots, etc. This is now illegal. You can be fined for this in New Jersey. The law allows it. It's a $500 fine for the first offense, and it can go up to $1,000 with each offense afterwards. So this is an easy one. If they care to enforce this, just be mindful of that. So sweep that up, blow it back in the yard, those types of things. Whenever you're using equipment, try to use it on level ground. That'll help out with spills. Anything that falls off the truck or falls into the bed of the truck and runs off into the street has a risk for getting into the stormwater system. So try to do things that minimize the threat for spills. Similar with mixing and loading operations, try to do it in an area that's not near a wellhead, a stream, a catch basin, anything that's going to pose the risk of a spill getting immediately into the water system and causing you a problem. Whoops, did I just click out of something?
I'm not sure. Oh, you're back.
I think I tried to move the thing off the screen and I clicked the wrong button. Sorry. Glad I'm back. Another technique you can think about is using tarps when you're doing your loading operations or mixing operations. If it's going to be sloppy and messy and you know it, you might want to take a tarp. You don't have to have a monstrous tarp, just wherever you're doing the work. And then it makes the cleanup much easier and straightforward. So tarps are a good thing if you're going to be messy. Always store your fertilizers in a secure, dry location. The back of a pickup truck is probably not a good place long term, especially if it's going to rain. If you happen to be in an applicator that does liquid applications, make sure that you try to eliminate your waste as much as possible. Try not to come back to the shop with a half full tank, and always try to not dump your residuals. Try to spray them out on turf. So spray the tank dry is the message here, rather than coming back and dumping, gallons down the drain. Always dispose of fertilizer containers properly. It's a good idea to develop a nutrient management plan. It's not required by law to have a nutrient management plan, but we do this all the time where I'm at. It's the only way to stay organized. It's the only way to be able to review what you've done and refine your practices for next year. And as long as you have a plan, you can review that and improve on that as time goes on, and hopefully make your operations more cost effective and also environmentally sound. So record keeping, the way we do it here is we're always summarizing those records for each growing season. We try to get all those reviews done by the 1st of March of the next year so that we can make any changes to our fertilization programs for that coming year. So we're entering into that period right now where we're reviewing what we've done and trying to make sure that any changes are figured out by the 1st of March so we can hit the ground running and make those changes. So, Mike, do you want to do the launching of the question number one?
Yeah, we're going to launch the first quiz of the night, guys. You've got a minute to, I'll give you a minute and a half to answer the question. And then when everyone comes back, we'll review it. So hopefully you now see the quiz. All right, we got 73% have submitted. Keep answering. Christopher Adams, you don't see the quiz. I don't know where it is. Go to the bottom of your screen and click on the go to training icon to see if it shows up.
Hey, Mike, am I supposed to see the quiz? Because I don't.
No, not you. Sorry.
Yeah, I didn't think I was. I'm on the other side, in the host side.
There you go. So I'm going to close the quiz down. We're at a minute and 35 seconds. And actually, I can't close the quiz. I'm going to have to ask you, Jim, to close the quiz.
Oh, what do I click, Mike?
On the thing that says close quiz.
Yeah, let me find that.
Yeah, I just figured out one of our little snafus.
Close. Which button is that? Close quiz.
It's under polls.
So I clicked something, but I don't think that did it. Did it?
No. Well, this is a fine how do you do.
I don't see anything that says there was a button pointing.
Yeah, click on the red arrow out.
Yeah.
I'm not, change over me to the presenter. Send it back to me if you could. Under sharing, it says change presenter. Send it to me. Sorry, folks, these things sometimes happen when you're working with new technology. So I apologize. Yeah, I know, Lou, you can hear me.
Okay, I made you the presenter.
Thank you so much. So let me close this. Hold on, screen sharing and so what it's not allowing me to do is to close the presentation. Okay, everyone, hold on. I'm going to jump out, I think, and I'll be right back. And we are locked up, Dr. Murphy.
We are?
We are completely locked.
Oh boy.
No. Technology is our friend.
Yes, it is.
I'm not ready to hit the panic button yet.
I can still hear you, Mike.
Yeah, so do me this favor, sir.
Yep.
If you could take back control of the presentation.
I take it back?
Yep, please take it back.
And how do I do that, Mike?
Don't worry. Hey, folks, this is a great time for you to get up and stretch your legs and maybe go to the bathroom and get a drink. We'll be back in about 1 minute as I log on with another computer.
It says you're the new presenter now.
Yep, that's what just happened. You sent it to my personal email and not this one, but that's
Oh,
okay.
oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I'm on two things so I can watch it simultaneously. Well, hey, welcome back, everybody. Let's share the results of the quiz. And hopefully right now you can see the results of the quiz. And it's showing that the average score was a 95%. So
Awesome.
hats off to all of you. Brilliant.
There we
So
go.
which represents the best management practices for nutrient management of turf? Yeah, soil testing, important. Make sure that you can use, if you possible, use lower rates of nitrogen and phosphorus. If you're going to be able to, if you have to make larger applications, more than 7/10 of a pound of nitrogen, make sure that you are using something that contains a slow release value in it. And this actually leads to a question, Dr. Murphy.
Yep.
Is SCRN, products that say they are SCRN, slow release, is that actually a slow release? Which is
Yes.
stabilized controlled release of nitrogen, which we see being popped up all over the place.
Yes. So technically, the stabilized controlled release nitrogen, if it's only the stabilizing component in the fertilizer, there's nothing else like sulfur coating or any other kind of protection against or to slow down the availability, it's not slow release. Stabilized nitrogen is protecting losses, but it isn't slowing down the release. It's essentially trying to keep the nitrogen in a water-soluble form from being lost either to volatilization or to leaching, because it'll eventually convert into nitrate. But it's not actually putting in a slow release form. It's protecting it from various losses. So unfortunately, that is not a slow release material. I actually have some slides on that, Mike, in the presentation, but they're towards the end, and we're already at 7:44, so I'm not sure we'll get to those slides. But
I'm not sure either. I sent back present for you to be the presenter, so if you just click on that, you can take control again.
absolutely.
Thank you. Hey guys, sorry about the technical glitch. We're just learning the technology. Lou, thank you. I feel better for that thumbs up.
All right, so do I have the correct screen shared yet?
Right now, we're looking at launch question number 1, so go ahead, sir.
All right, so where in the heck is my, there we go. All right, so as you know, we're talking about fertilization, but I will put this slide in here to remind people that whenever you change things up in your program, you have to be mindful that perhaps other things need to change as well. And so always be mindful that even though we're talking about fertilizer practices, and you may want to go out and change things, be thoughtful about whether that's going to impact the mowing program or possibly the irrigation program. They are interrelated, and changes in one often do force changes in other practices. So you have to watch out for that. I want to focus on nitrogen primarily here in the rest of the talk, the rest of the time that we have, and just show some visual pictures here. This coloration, I know this is a pretty grainy picture. This is a old photo from a early smartphone. It wasn't as smart as they are today. So the picture quality isn't great, but I think you can see the color of this turf. This turf is very off color, very, very, light green. Some would even say there's brown in there. This is turf that hasn't been fertilized in years, and it shows it. This is a picture of turf that's very well fertilized. There's plenty of nitrogen in the system. You can tell by the color of the grass. So color is a very strong indicator. It's not a very accurate indicator. You're not going to be able to necessarily say, oh, that has 3% nitrogen in those leaves, or 2.5 or 3.5. But when you contrast this to this, you can tell there's more nitrogen in the system here than in the previous photo. And again, here's another picture of a property that the grass is obviously very well fertilized and doing quite well. This is the same property, but a different section, obviously. And this is a section that is not irrigated. Now, if you didn't know that, you might look at this and say, oh, that looks under fertilized. Well, this turf is just underwatered and it's kind of going sort of towards dormancy. It's not in dormancy completely, but it's actually thinning out, turning off color because it's not getting enough water during a dry period. And as soon as it starts raining again, this will green back up and start growing. And this would not be a situation where you would want to put more fertilizer on this turf. You would probably want to put less on it until the natural rains return and it starts to grow again. So color is useful, but it can be a little deceiving at times. There are technically a lot of different factors that go into developing a fertilization program that you want to think about. We've touched on some of these already, but this is a more comprehensive list. We talked about soil test results, soil texture, sands being the big one if you're working on sandy soils. The environmental thing, the red flag for environmental problems ought to flash up for you. We talked about age and the history of turf. If you have an old turf that's been very well fertilized, it's probably going to not need a lot of fertilizer to keep it going. We mentioned species of grass, fine fescue, tall fescue being possible candidates for lower input. Management factors like clipping removal, irrigation, the condition of the turf, and what your desired quality all play into how much you need to fertilize. If you're removing clippings, you're going to have to fertilize more because you're removing nutrients off site. You're taking them away, you're mining it, however you want to describe it. You're losing nutrients by removing clippings, and it's going to end up forcing you to put more nutrients down in the form of fertilizer.
I'd like to ask about an old wives' tale, Dr. Murphy.
Sure.
Been told since I started in the industry that clippings create thatch. That's not a true statement, is it?
No, it's not. There would be an indirect way that clippings could contribute to thatch, but clippings break down very fast. They are mostly water. I think on the order of 85, 90% water, and they rot away pretty quickly. The only way that you could make an argument that clippings would increase thatch is if you did not adjust your fertilizer program. Let's say you were removing clippings, you decided to return clippings, but you didn't adjust your fertilization program. You just increased your fertility by returning clippings. And some estimates are, I have this in another slide, but some estimates are that you're increasing your fertility by 25% by returning clippings. So if you start returning clippings after having removed them, but you don't change your fertilizer practice, you could be over fertilizing the turf and thus create more thatch that way. But it's really the fertilization that's creating more thatch, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. So you're saying if I return clippings, I could basically reduce my nitrogen input from 4 pounds a year to 3 pounds, and still get the same quality of turf, put more money in my pocket, and from an environmental standpoint, it's better.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a straightforward way of putting it. Absolutely. Other factors that we talked about irrigation, overwatering, but the other thing you need to think about is the condition and the desired quality of turf. And so not everybody wants the same quality of turf. Many people do, but you have to take that into consideration. If you're not having to have the thickest, luscious, darkest green looking turf, then you don't need as much fertilizer to produce that quality. If your turf is healthy and thick versus thinned out and damaged and it needs to recover, then the damaged, thinned out turf needs more fertilization to get it back into good condition. Whereas the healthy, thick stuff might need just a little tickle of fertility. So understanding what the condition of the turf is important. And then there's factors like budget, equipment, and that pertains to things like liquid versus granular. Do you have the budget to do a spray operation or not? And obviously experience is important in this discussion as well. Being able to recognize what you're looking at and understanding whether it's drought stress or nitrogen stress. Talk a little bit more about leaching here. Again, a well-planned, carefully thought out irrigation fertilization program is important when it comes to leaching. If you make things too wet, you're going to probably increase the risk of leaching. And so excessive water is what you got to watch out for in the form of excess irrigation or natural rainfalls. And this is a big problem on sandy soils, as we've mentioned before. We just talked about the nitrogen in the clippings. It's been estimated that as much as a 25% change in your program can happen if you're returning versus removing clippings. And then we also talked about this earlier, using grasses that don't require as much nitrogen, things like fine fescues and tall fescues. So shall we try to launch another question? And will we mess this one up, Mike?
I am scared half to death. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make myself the presenter again. So hopefully I have control.
Okay.
And then I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to launch the next quiz. And I think, Dr. Murphy, because we are running out of time, I think let's do this quiz.
Yep.
And then let's be done and then open it up for question and answers. Will that work for you, sir? I appreciate it so much.
Perfect.
Appreciate you being flexible on this.
No, so, we got to. I mean, this is new territory, so.
Launching the second quiz. You got 1 minute and 30 seconds. Go get them. I got to say, Dr. Murphy, this is a pretty smart group. Already 52% have responded.
They know their stuff.
John Raffini, I'm sorry you still can't see a quiz, but 70% of the people can, so I don't know where our technology is failing on that side. I'll hopefully get around to that. Sorry, Christopher Adams. I'm glad you texted me, so you did show me that it's not showing you the quiz, but other people are seeing it, so I don't know whose end it's on. But we'll try to work through it. This is only our second attempt at doing this type of a webinar.
Yeah, we'll get better at this as time goes on, so.
All right, so we're at that point where everyone seems to be, who can submit it, has submitted. So we're going to close it up. Let's review it. I'm going to share it with the folks. So we had 17 submit, 88% was the average score. So which species of turfgrass has the lowest requirement for nitrogen fertilizer? And the answer was fine fescues. And would that be closely followed up, Dr. Murphy, by tall fescues not needing as much as well?
Right. Yep. That would have been, if that was an option, that would have been a correct answer if it was in the list. Yep.
And so my next question has to be, which is the neediest of grasses for nitrogen? Which are the ones that have to have the most?
So that's an interesting question. It's one of those questions that it does depend on the situation. I think most people would argue that the bluegrasses, Kentucky bluegrasses, require the most, and they certainly do if you think about it from the standpoint of trying to establish where bluegrasses really need a lot of fertilizer is when you're trying to establish Kentucky bluegrass. They are very slow to get going, and they suck up a lot of nitrogen to establish bluegrass. So and some would argue that once you get bluegrass established, it isn't quite the nitrogen hog that it is when it's a baby. But babies take a lot of food. The Kentucky bluegrass seedlings do, and so you have to really push those with fertilizer. And I would say, ryegrass is kind of in the middle there.
If I'm gonna put you on the spot, if you had to pick a variety that's your favorite, what's your favorite grass variety?
Huh. From my personal lawn perspective, all right. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of lazy. I'll admit it. I don't like to mow as much. So I do my own yard, so I don't pay anybody to do it. So I'm the one, or my son is the one pushing the lawnmower. So we grow fine fescues in my yard because you don't have to mow them as much either. We didn't talk about that. We're focused on nitrogen fertility, but that's why I grow fine fescues, because I mow my own yard. And you can skip mowing 1 or 2 weeks during the middle of summer when it's really warm and dry and the grass isn't growing very much.
Yeah, I was
But
gonna say,
it's not a grass for everybody. I'll be the first to admit that.
yeah, my fine fescues in the middle of the summer, it looks like a hayfield because I have heavy clay in full sun. So they just dry out. I don't have any hard fescues, but I have a lot. I guess it's creeping or Jones. I don't know.
Yeah, they're hard to identify. You got to really look very closely to know what you're working with. And
Absolutely.
I even struggle with it, being able to identify them.
Yeah. So before we open it up to questions and answers, and I'm going to read the questions to Dr. Murphy off the chat log. I need to again stress that you need to email a picture of you holding your license to exec director at NewJerseyTurfgrass.org, and make sure you put in the subject line today's date with the word class behind it. So if you don't do it, you haven't done it, make sure you do it real soon. Yes, Bruce, you should do it this evening. Thank you for asking the question. With that, I would like to start reading the chat log, and there was a bunch of questions in here, Jim. So if you've got some time, I would
Sure,
like to read them to you.
absolutely.
I'm just scrolling back. Okay, the first question is from Robert Shin. He goes, what is the difference, if any, for a buffer zone with a liquid versus a granular fertilizer? So is there a difference in the buffer zone when using either or product?
No, I'm assuming that's they're referring to the rules about fertilizing in a buffer zone, and the
Yes, sir.
rules don't distinguish between the form of the material. What they do distinguish between is whether it's uh, what's referred to as a directed application. In other words, do you have complete control of where that product is going? So if you are using a spray boom where you're spraying this spot and you have an edge to that application that's very precise, then you're allowed to get closer to the water, 10 feet. But if you're just using a big cyclone spreader, a pendulum spreader that's flinging it all directions, and there isn't a well-defined edge to the application where it stops, then you're required to stay 25 feet. So obviously with a spray versus a granular, you could interpret that as whether that has something to do with the restrictions, but really it has to come down to when you're making an application, are you making a very clearly defined edge with your application? If you are, then you can get closer to the water. If you're not, and you're just rotary spreading it out, 20, 30 feet in all directions, and you don't have that clear, like, here's where my application stops, you've got to stay farther away.
Okay, thank you. Next, hopefully, Robert, that answered your question. Next up is James Wallace, and he wants to know, is there a setback requirement when we're talking about retention basins that have turf in them?
Yeah, this is a complicated one to answer because there are so many entities that control the rules of a retention basins that I can't make a universal, this is the answer to it. So the best thing I can tell you on retention basins is to make sure you get in touch with the owner, the person who's in charge of that detention basin, and find out what the rules are, whether you're supposed to be fertilizing in there or not. I have approached DEP about this question more than once, and it's a complicated situation because there's so many different entities that control those basins, and they have their different rules and regs. So unfortunately, I wish I could give you a generic, hey, this covers all. The best thing I can tell you is try not to fertilize those if you don't have to, because those are where water goes, and a lot of water goes all real fast at once. I would certainly, if you're fertilizing those basins, as a general rule of thumb, if you're going to do it, I would watch the weather closely and make sure there isn't a storm event on your heels, because of all the storm water that ends up going to those basins will move that material on you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ken McPeak, and he wants to know, how far down does fertilizer translocate, I guess, leach into the soil over time? That's a complex answer, so I'm glad you're handling it, not me.
Yeah, it is. There's fertilizers, if applied correctly, the leaching is very minimal, and it won't go very far if it's applied correctly. Now, what we talked about some of those things tonight in the seminar. So what do we mean by correctly? Well, the soil's not too wet when you make the application, and there isn't a big irrigation or a big rainfall coming immediately after the irrigation. If the soil's, you don't want the soil to be bone dry, but you only want it to be moist. You don't want it to be sloppy wet. You need moisture to dissolve and make the nutrients available in the soil solution. You know, the nutrients have to be in the water for the plants to take them up. So you have to have some water. So we're not talking about bone dry conditions here, but you also don't want it to be really wet, because that's, if there's too much water and it's moving past the root zone, that's when you're going to get some leaching. And so the other factor is then the cumulative amount of nitrogen you're putting over time. So there's the per application rate concept to keep in mind, but there's also the cumulative annual rate, and that's why there's an annual rate cap at 4¼ pounds in New Jersey. Because if you constantly fertilize turf at 4, 5, 6 pounds a year, it's eventually going to build up so much nitrogen in the system, it's going to just start naturally, grass can't hold it all. It's going to start seeping past the root system. So, you know, that, in a nutshell, those are kind of the major factors right there.
Thank you. Next question, John Raffini. What type of buffer plantings do you recommend for a detention pond? Is this your expertise?
This is not my expertise. I would probably pick a plant, and an ecologist would scream at me and say, "No, you don't want to do that." That's not my specialty. There are people that do specialize in that, and if you really would like to get in touch with someone who's more expert on those types of plants, I'd be glad to try to track that down for you. But that's not really my expertise. Most people would tell you anything but grass, but.
All right, so this is a great question. This is from Joseph Melbinger. He goes, since the fertilizer law has been acted, have there been any measurable reduction in eutrophication? I guess they're looking at maybe the Barnegat Bay, which they were talking about, had eutrophication problems.
Yeah, I have not. I personally haven't looked into that information in a while. It's probably been a couple of years since I've looked it up. And at the time of the law, back in 2011, the DEP was getting geared up to put out monitoring systems around Barnegat Bay, in Barnegat Bay, to start tracking this. And they're, by law, they're required to report, you know, the status of water bodies across the state. And I'm working from memory. It's been a while, like I said, it's been a while since I looked it up, but they have a kind of a rotating reporting scheme. where I believe they've broken up the state into different zones. And so I think, again, don't quote me on this, but I think they're supposed to be reporting on water bodies in various zones throughout the state every 3 years. So if you do the math, what are we? We're about 9 years in, roughly, since the law was passed. I don't know whether that's been enough reporting to show a markable change since the laws have been enacted, but it's a very good question, and to maybe revisit some old discussions when we had conversations with the state as the legislatures were contemplating this law. This issue was brought up that perhaps you should write into the law that we'll do some research to prove whether or not this law is working. Of course, they didn't do that, so we don't have that written as a statute to do that kind of assessment. But DEP is monitoring that, and there may be some data available now that shows whether or not anything's changed. Hopefully, it is, but I quite honestly don't know what the answer is. But the data is being collected by DEP.
Nice, nice. So to quote you, we don't know.
We don't know. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. We're not
I
sure.
think I probably should put it on my list of things to do to call DEP and say, hey, I get this question. Do you have a response to it that I could share with people when they ask it? So I will do that. I'll make that a goal for this winter, is to contact DEP about that.
There's another question. It says, when detention ponds are dry, is there a preferred type of turf to use in them?
Preferred height? Did you say, Mike?
Type. TYPE.
Oh, type. That. I don't know that there's a preferred type, but from a turf point of view, if you're going to put anything in a detention basin, I think it should be tall fescue. That's going to be the most durable grass. It's going to be the easiest to establish from seed. It's not as easy as ryegrass, but it will, if you get it to take, it's going to hold up better. And I think it's just going to perform better in that kind of environment.
Yeah, just if you didn't know it, Dr. Murphy, I am a tall fescue evangelist. I preach about tall fescues and its virtues. And Lou's giggling because he's in a class. Every time I say the word tall fescue, he's in a 6-hour class. I made the group respond with an amen.
Amen.
That's how excited I am about tall fescue.
They were saying amen a lot, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a religious experience.
Somewhat, yes. So guys, with that said, there's no more questions. If you have any more questions, type it up in the chat log. If not, I think we're done. We've run a little bit over. I just want you to know if we didn't get to one of your questions, but I think we got to everybody's question. Or if you come up with a question after the presentation's over, please just email it to execdirector@NewJerseyTurfGrass.org, the same place that you're sending a picture of you holding your license. I want to thank you, Jim, for speaking today, and thanks for all of you for participating in this webinar.